Deb Dana, welcome to the How Humans Work podcast. I'm really excited to have you on the show today. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's nice to be here with you. Nice to meet you.
It is nice to meet you. And I found your work, and I found your Polyvagal Theory in Therapy book, which I really, really, really like. And then I downgraded the level of comprehension and really explored your book, Anchored, which is a little bit more user-friendly for lay people or people who aren't in clinical or professional practices working with the nervous system. So tell me how you found yourself steeped in polyvagal theory. Like, how did you find your way to this in it?
Yeah. Yeah. Don't you love origin stories? Don't you love to hear how people got where they are? Because usually we have no idea we're going to end up here, right? I was always a neuroscience nerd when I was, I'm a clinical social worker and working with clients. I always thought it was important for me to understand and them to understand their brains. And then I read Steve Porges's first book, and it was like, oh my gosh, I have this whole piece of the human being that I have neglected, the nervous system. And from then on, I was sold with Steve's work and reached out to him and asked him if he would come to Maine, where I live part of the time, and do a training for my colleagues, because I just thought it was such an important part of understanding how we are human, because the nervous system really is what begins that whole process of how we are human. So that's kind of where it started. And Steve and I laugh now because that was, 2000, I don't know, 11, 12, somewhere around there. And who knew that we would end up where we are now? So it's one of those reminders that if you are interested in something and you reach out, you never know what's going to happen, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So what's evolved? What's been born out of that initial meeting and for you?
Well, I read his book and loved his theory and immediately thought, how do I bring this to my clients? Because that's where I always go with things. How do I make this user-friendly for my clients? And so I worked with a group of clinicians, and I think I drove them crazy for the first, 6, 8 months, because I would come in and say, try this, try this, try this. And then I started doing workshops to play around with concepts and ideas and how might we bring, those, what I consider the 3 organizing principles of co-regulation, neuroception, hierarchy, into application in a way that's understandable. So by the time I reached out to Steve and by the time he came to Maine, I was already developing this stuff. And then it was like, oh my gosh, do I dare show it to the person, and the person, if you've never, met him or listened to him, is a brilliant scientist, truly brilliant scientist, and the most kind human, right? So it's this lovely combination of qualities in a human being. And so he, of course, was delighted that I was taking his work and, making ladders and scales and continuums and all this stuff. And really, in that moment, I think changed my life forever. I tell him that. I say, this was a before and after moment, because you said, wow, I really like what you're doing. And he lent his name, his credibility, his heart to my work. And that was that defining moment, right? Yeah.
Yeah, goosebumps. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I am curious about who you were before and appreciate that. But what would you say was what was the passage that opened up for you by getting his blessing and kind of going with this, like, hey, I can teach this, I can bring this to the world. Yeah.
I mean, it's that sense of credibility. I think that, I was a trauma specialist. I, had lots of training and, I was IFS trained. I was sensory motor trained. I did, Bessel's traumatic stress certificate. I'd done all the things. And yet, like many people, I had this sense of, who am I, right? Who am I to think that I have something to offer to the world? And I actually created, I wrote the first book. I created all this stuff in the finished room over my garage in Maine, right? And so somehow you do this and you think, well, it's working with my clients, but it's like, what if I put it out in the world and people, lots of people see it, then what? So it's it's that amazing experience I think most of us still have of, I guess we call it imposter syndrome, but it felt
That's right.
very,
Yeah.
very wired into my biology. Don't get big, which I
Uh-huh.
think on a nervous system level, that's sort of an autonomic response pattern, a survival pattern that was wired into my system. And so, it was like, ooh, I'm really bumping up against all sorts of stuff here. So, when Steve said, this is great, it was like, ooh, maybe, and he had asked me if I would co-edit a book with him. And that's the Blue book, the clinical applications book that we did together. And that was lovely because I got to talk to people and they, I sort of had this inferred credibility because I was working with Steve and things began
Yeah.
to shift. And from that, I reached out to our publisher at Norton and I said, do you think there's any room for my clinical application work? And she said, I don't know, send me some samples. And you can imagine what that did to my nervous system. It took me like 6 weeks to put together something to send to her. And so it was, and then it was, oh yeah, let's do this. So, it's interesting though, the nervous system needs repeated experiences of something different. We call them disconfirming experiences. That's Bruce Ecker's language, and I love his language. But we need repeated experiences of that. And in the therapy world, we think, we offer something, a client has something that feels different, does it differently, and that's good. But not true. We need that repeated over and over. And my personal journey reminds me of that all the time, that I needed to be shown on a biological level many, many times that, yes, this was in fact a good path forward and that I could do this. So it's I think our personal journeys always remind us of how we're working with clients. Because again, we all have a nervous system and it's wired in the same way and it works the same way. So why would mine work any different from any of my clients, right?
Well, I love the connection between your own path and actually the teachings of polyvagal theory, right? So you had to walk and live with the risk and getting bigger exactly in your nervous system. And I've been interested in the nervous system for a long time because, as I mentioned to you, really deeply interested in evolution. And in Chinese medicine, the thing that kind of stood out to me beyond all the theory is, okay, this is working with people's stress response. This is working with people's stress experience, right? And so let's get into polyvagal theory and what I would call the backbone of our human experience, our nervous system, and how we can begin to understand and, as you say, befriend this deep thing of who we are or that runs us. Yeah, so teach us about that.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I'll be curious to hear how you weave in Chinese medicine because I don't know a lot about it, but every now and then people talk about it and go, ooh, that's interesting. So please weave that in too.
I will.
I think first we think about our dysregulated responses, right? That happen through what Steve named neuroception. So neuroception is the way the nervous system takes in information. Right. And we either have a neuroception of safety or some sort of unsafety. And neuroception uses 3 pathways to take in that information. So it uses the what's happening in the body pathway, the inside pathway. It uses the environmental, what's happening in the world around us pathway. And it uses a between pathway, which is when I love it. It uses the what's happening nervous system to nervous system. Right. So your nervous system and mine are doing that getting to know each other experience. Our brains are as well, but our nervous systems are feeling into, does this feel safe or not? So when the cues of safety from those 3 pathways outweigh the cues of danger, then we're ready to move forward. We're regulated enough that we can engage and do whatever it is we're wanting to do with our day. But when the cues of danger outweigh the cues of safety, then we move into a survival response, right? We get dysregulated. And our survival responses, Steve's work really identified that we have 2 different survival responses. We have a regulated response, and then we have 2 survival responses. The first being the sympathetic nervous system's fight and flight that everybody knows, right? We go to fight and flight. We go to anger and anxiety, and that's a survival response that happens when we feel in danger. The other survival response, if we feel in extreme danger, and in more intense danger will take us to the dorsal collapse, which is what Steve identified. And that's why he calls it Polyvagal Theory, because it's dorsal vagal and the regulated state is ventral vagal. So you have two vagal, polyvagal. So that's why it's named polyvagal. And this dorsal vagal response of no energy, no interest, collapse, disconnect, if, in the evolutionary history, is the earliest part of our nervous system, right? That's where the human nervous system began in our phylogenetic history, right? We would immobilize to survive, right? And you still see that in our system today, right? Because evolution doesn't throw anything out, it builds on top of. So this response of collapse, disconnect, dissociate at one end, or simply, this going through the motions, but don't really care, don't have the energy. That's that continuum of collapse, right? So, we have these three responses, and they work in a specific order, which is the beautiful part about understanding this, is that dorsal is the first, sympathetic, and then ventral. It's built that way. And our nervous system truly, I believe, longs to have us in that state of ventral regulation. I think that's where it that's that healthy homeostasis that biologically we're looking for. Yes, cognitively we're searching for too, but biologically we're looking for that. And I think the nervous system knows how to get us there. I think that's a sustaining belief I hold in my work, that your nervous system knows how to get there. It may have lost the way. It may not have traveled there that often because of your trauma experiences, but I don't have to put something inside you that's not already there. It lives there. We just have to uncover it and help you then travel that pathway, right? And again, you love evolution. Evolution has built this into our biology. It's beautiful, isn't it?
Amazing. Yeah. Let's break down the idea of the vagus nerve a little bit, because most people probably aren't coming with a sophistication around the nervous system and the body. So the vagus nerve, as I understand, it's the 10th cranial nerve.
Yep.
And you're saying it has two aspects, a ventral and a dorsal aspect.
Right.
Yeah. So keep going with that.
Yeah, it's the longest. We have 12 cranial nerves, and the vagus is the longest one. And vagus is wanderer in Latin. And if you see an image of it, it wanders from your brainstem. It comes around the side of your neck, travels down, and then it wanders throughout your body. It hits all sorts of organs, and it's just the image can be lovely to think of, as it just has all of these sort of pieces that come out from it. Basically,
it's almost like it's cascading.
Yeah.
It's almost like it cascades through the whole internal environment. Yeah.
It's lovely. And if we talk about cascading, and 80% of the information then travels from the body up to the brain along that cascading highway, from the body, from all the organs up to the brain. And 20% is the brain's response back. Isn't that fascinating?
I was reading that. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. That is amazing. What do you make of that? Like when you get those proportions?
Well, but for me, it's a reminder that we need to not be so brain-centric, right? Because the brain is getting the information from the body, and then the brain's making up a story to help us use that information in some way. But we're such a top-down, in the clinical world, we've been top-down for a long time. And I think I don't want to be just bottom-up, but I need bottom-up to meet top-down. So it's that sort of paradigm shift that 80-20 really reminds me, oh, right. We have so much information that is there for us if we can connect to it. Yeah. So, back to vagus, from the brainstem basically to the diaphragm is the ventral vagal world, and from the diaphragm downward is the dorsal vagal world, because in its regulating role, the dorsal vagus runs your digestion. That's its job, right? It has a survival role of collapse, disconnect, etc. But it has an everyday responsibility to run your digestion. And if you have moments in your life when you are under stress, when you are suffering, when you are overwhelmed, you'll notice your digestion is off as well. That's because the dorsal vagus has now gone into survival rather than everyday regulation. right? It's a great clue that something's not right in your life when your digestion is off, because that's a nervous system message, right? Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. So it's a lot about listening to the body, and I'm flashing on a number of things. One, I'll just pepper in a little bit of Chinese medicine.
Mm,
There's this idea in Chinese medicine about liver qi stagnation,
mm,
which is the free flow of emotions. And the herbal formula for that liver qi stagnation, the classic one, is called relaxed wanderer,
mm,
like the vagabond.
love it.
And I always describe liver qi stagnation as a fixation on any particular emotion, and that we want the free flow of emotions. And I'll go on a little bit later about the kidney meridian and the connections between what you're speaking of. But I'll get a little personal here. I was in my men's group a few weeks back, and been going through some things in my relationship with some family members, and my mom in particular, who's going through some health things. And I was working through some of my stuff, and I just opened up, and then, it's kind of classic men's stuff, probably women's stuff. They're like, come on in, let's hold you,
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, I don't want to do that, but I'll do it because I should try it, And I had the most interesting experience, which was I couldn't hold myself up anymore. And it was almost like just the opportunity to let go, it was like, I was just like, it wasn't any conscious decision. It was almost like my dorsal vagal system was like, okay, buddy, you can collapse right now. You can go here. And it was incredibly beautiful to be held in that way. But I also like getting personal and honest, because I think that's important for how we understand our human nature. But I think it's also a really beautiful example of this embodiment that you talk about. Like, when we befriend our nervous system, it's not like befriending something foreign to us. Right. It's actually the thing in us. And so let's talk more about this 80% of the ears, the eyes, the head movement, this way we actually experience our nervous system, if you would.
Yeah. The ears, the eyes, the tone of voice, the head movement, that's all part of what Steve identified as your social engagement system, right? That's connected to your ventral vagal system. And, you're sending messages through your eyes, through tone of voice. Tone of voice is huge. Nervous system listens to tone of voice before it listens to actual language, right? So if your tone of voice feels safe and welcoming to my nervous system, I'm going to listen to what you say. But if it feels like a warning, I'm going to really struggle to take in what you're saying, right? So fascinating.
Yeah.
The head nod, the head turn and tilt. We don't think about it, but biologically it is wired in to your nervous system to be a cue of safety, to be a welcome, right? And so if you are suffering with some sort of a lack of ability to move your head, you are sending a cue of danger, whether you mean to or not, right? You can be perfectly kind and have eyes that are kind and smile. But if you can't move your head, that's a cue of danger to another nervous system. It's fascinating, right? Yeah.
That is fascinating. It reminds me of patients I've had. I've seen a lot of connection between neck pain and anxiety. Yeah. And when people have limited range of motion, maybe because they've been stressed, or for other, architectural reasons in the skeleton, that they also will oftentimes have anxiety that goes along with it.
Yeah. And right. So they can't send, and they're not. And so if I can't send cues of safety, your system is going to then not send back to me cues of safety. It becomes that circuit, that cycle. And so if I'm in chronic pain, I can't move my neck, and I'm sending that and getting back a warning, then my anxiety goes, it becomes that feedback loop, right? Yeah. The thing that's interesting is, because people ask me all the time, they say, well, I have limited range of motion in my neck. I said, okay, just tell people, give people the context. Context is huge for the nervous system. If I tell you, I have a stiff neck today, so I have limited range of motion, your nervous system's going to notice that. Then you will notice it, but your brain is going to have the information to make up the correct story, which is, Deb's got a stiff neck today, rather than she doesn't like me. She's not safe to be around, right? So giving context is such an important part of this way of working.
It's beautiful. Yeah. Love that. I mean, I think it's so important. I kind of have that context because I work with health and I work with the
Yeah.
body and I pay attention to people.
Yeah.
So I don't have those same reactions.
Mhm.
I've that maybe someone who
Mhm.
wouldn't understand that be like, oh, that person's got a stiff neck
Right.
or their back's hurting. Like
Right.
I'm always have
Right. Yeah.
that surveillance
Yeah.
system. And I want to get back to that neuroception idea a little
Yeah.
bit, which is the surveillance system around safety and danger,
Mm. Mm.
right? And most of this is happening below the radar. I mean,
Yeah.
it's subtle. It's kind of half there. You're like, oh, that person seems a little
Mhm.
tense, but they have a stiff neck, maybe,
Mhm.
right? But talk more about this below the radar, below the conscious process
Yeah.
aspect of safety and danger that's wired in us.
Yeah. Yeah. It is happening below your thinking brain, right? We can bring perception to it, which is what we do when we want to work with it, but it happens all the time, just below the level of our awareness, and I think most people understand neuroception through, they might say they had a gut feeling or they had, some intuition, right? We give it all sorts of names. That's your nervous system's neuroception at work, right? Like you might walk into a room and see someone and think, oh, I think I want to get to know that person. Neuroception has sent you some cues. Or you might walk into a room and go, not my crowd. You're getting a different neuroceptive experience, right? And we can go back afterwards and we can sort of identify what were the cues of safety and the cues of danger. But in the moment, your nervous system is taking in a broad, big amount of information and then pushing you in one direction or another. Yeah. And so oftentimes it makes no sense, right? It makes no sense. And it doesn't have to make sense because, again, it is not a thinking experience. It's an embodied experience. Yeah. Based on our past too, right? Neuroception takes in information over the course of our lifetime. And then if a familiar cue comes alive in the present moment, the nervous system doesn't distinguish past from present. It simply takes in the cue and then I'm off and running, right? It might be that you have this gorgeous color green in your background. It might be that color green is a cue of danger for my nervous system. And I might not
Whoops.
have any idea about that at all, but I
Yeah,
might
right.
struggle in this interview, in this conversation that's happening. And afterwards, I might think, oh, that was terrible. And I never wanted, and I would have no idea. And it was, right? Neuroception of unsafety because of an environmental cue, right?
Yeah.
So we have to sort of be curious about what is prompting that experience.
Of threat, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's talk about that. How do we get curious and how do we build a relationship with neuroception when most of it's happening below the surface?
Yeah.
And some of the signals may be artifacts from past experiences. Yeah.
I mean, that is the bringing perception to neuroception. That's a process, right? So it's like in the moment. And I would work with my clients who would say, I had an extreme response and I tried to figure it out. And I would say, when you have that extreme response, don't try and figure it out in the moment. Just do what your nervous system is telling you. And then let's reflect on it afterwards, because in the moment, it's too big, right? Your prefrontal cortex is not there to help you do all this reflection and bring curiosity to what happened. Later, we can reflect. So the first way we work with neuroception is to reflect on a moment. Right. So think of a moment where you're curious about, you wonder, was my response needed? Right. Was it, in proportion to what was happening? And then we go back and we take apart that moment. We think, what are the cues of danger as we look back on it now? Right. And we identify concretely cues of danger. What were the cues of safety that maybe were there, but you missed? Because we often miss the cues of safety because we're focused on the cues of danger. Supposed to be. That's the negativity bias. It works that
That's
way
right.
for all of us.
That's
supposed
right.
to.
That's right.
So,
That's
but we
right.
can identify what are the cues of danger, what are the cues of safety, and then we can get a clear vision of, oh, that's why I had that response. My neuroception was one of danger because of this, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this gets it close to trauma, right?
Yep.
Like how we're working. So I've always been interested in stress, and I feel like I've a pretty good handle on it. But how would you distinguish trauma and stress as it relates to the patterns of the nervous system, if that makes sense?
And it's interesting because The nervous system patterns are shaped to serve our safety and survival, right? And at the moment they were shaped, they were needed. They may not be needed now, but they were needed then, right? And oftentimes when we're working with trauma, it's a response that has been carried forward because it was wired in, and it just became what the nervous system does when it feels that neuroception of danger. It does this pattern of response. Stress, and I'm not even sure what we want to call stress or distress or dysregulation or whatever.
Right.
Language is interesting, isn't it? Because we want to stretch the nervous system. We're always wanting to stretch. So we, push a little bit, try something a little new. That's what we do in therapy. We're saying, let's try this. Let's see what happens when we do this. So we want to stretch, but not stress the system. Once we stretch and move into stress, we then move into survival, right? So in some ways, it doesn't matter how you get there, whether it's a trauma response or an overwhelm because of all the stuff going on in my day. Once I hit a survival response, then my nervous system is going to be in whatever flavor of survival response it's taken me to, right? The thing that's different is if it's stress because of my current living environment, what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, all of the things that are coming at me, and my system knows regulation, then I'm working to reduce the stress and I'll come back to regulation. If it's trauma and I have a history of trauma and trauma response, there aren't things going on in the present day that I can reduce that will bring me to regulation. I have to figure out, first, I think what I do is help clients find regulation just as a thing on its own. What does that feel like? Can I find moments, micro moments even of noticing, oh, I'm regulated for a moment. That's a different experience. Once we have enough of those experiences, we bring some of that regulation back to the traumatic moments so that we can revisit them and not relive them. So it's a different process, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It's a really good differentiation. I think that's a really good distinction between stresses and stretching is somewhat manageable, and we have the resources of regulation. And one of the things I think is important to talk about in understanding polyvagal theory is regulation, right? So that's the third principle, along with neuroception and hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about what regulation is. And I want to kind of also ask you to break down the word regulation. It's a little abstract, and if you can kind of give us some body and feeling of what's it mean to be regulated. That's not.
And everybody's going to have a different experience of that. But regulation happens. Our body comes into some sort of balance. Your ventral vagal state is now running the show, so to speak, in your nervous system. And when that happens, we have access to curiosity, to passion, to purpose, to quiet, to play, to all of those lovely experiences, right? And our body feels, I don't know, the sense I have in my body when I'm feeling some regulation is there's this, it's a flow of some sort. Sympathetic feels very disjointed and chaotic, and dorsal feels flat. And so, ventral feels like there's a flow to it. And that's one of the first things we do is, help people identify, how does your body show you you're in a bit of balance, a bit of regulation, right?
Yeah, I love that in your book, Anchored, and the way you invite people to explore their own language of this polyvagal theory. And for me, when I'm in ventral vagal, I call it my twin brother. It's like an IFS thing. It's like I have this part of me that just like isn't hung up on anything. It's just open. It's ready for it. There's just, it's just here and it's alive,
right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I love hearing everybody's, description of what ventral is for them. Right. I mean, that's really the joy of being human is it's the same biological state, and we describe it so differently, and it feels so different to us. I just love yours. That was lovely. Right.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So is there more on the regulation part, on the skills around that, or on the...
We have two categories of regulation. We have co-regulation, which is, what I do with other people to feel connected, to feel safe, to feel balanced, and then what I do on my own, right? And we need both, right? And the interesting thing for many trauma survivors, when they came into the world, they weren't met with a person who had a regulated nervous system who could help them, who could do that, oh, you're here and I'm going to, be with you and support your growth. They didn't get that. So they didn't learn that co-regulating skill. They had to self-regulate instead, right? And so that's backwards in the way we're meant to develop. We're supposed to co-regulate and then self-regulate. And for so many of us, that's twisted upside down, right? That said, we still need both. Over the course of our lifetime, we still need both. So if you're really good at self-regulating, because you had to be, it may be a challenge to trust people enough to co-regulate. As we, work with people, we are maybe the first person that's been safe enough to co-regulate with. We take that on in the helping profession. It's our job to be regulated and offer that welcome.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's where like the transference stuff comes in and that whole thing, because it's this need, and all of a sudden it can be confusing to suddenly have it met by
it can be really scary to a nervous system to have, because that's an unfamiliar experience. And unfamiliar is often a cue of danger to the nervous system. Rather than being exciting, ooh, what's going to happen? It's terrifying, right?
Yeah.
So, and unpredictable is the other "un" that I like to talk about. Unfamiliar, unpredictable. They are both often cues of danger to a nervous system that has not experienced a lot of safety.
Yeah. I mean, we're so close to the political conversation, but I don't want to go there quite yet. I want to turn towards the, Chinese medicine. There's a great, a fantastic teacher, a man named Jeffrey Yuen. He's like 88th holder of all these titles in the Taoist tradition, and I've seen him teach, and he's amazing. He's understated, but he's wise and calm beyond, and informed beyond most people I've ever met. And one of the things I heard him talk about, and there's this idea, channels, right? So nervous system and channels. We've all heard about meridians and channels, and I remember him describing there's these extraordinary channels, right? There's the regular channels of the organs, but then there's these extra ones. And some of them are platforms at which, the way he described it in my recollection, is it's kind of like our evolution. It's like, this is the platform. But the Ren, which is also called the conception, which is the front channel in the middle and comes up to the eyes. I remember him describing it was like this, the baby and the mom. And the Ren comes online. It needs that contact, that eye contact, and that chest connection, and that bodied connection, right? Where of being met for the Ren actually to start functioning. And the Ren is the Chinese word for human. So our humanity comes, and there's connections with the Ren channel and the heart and other interrelated things, but it's the same story for me. It's that same conversation.
And the I don't know about the Ren, you'll have to tell me, but the lovely thing about the nervous system and the hopeful experience around Steve's polyvagal theory is that those connections are waiting, right? And if they were missed early on, doesn't mean they can't be felt and connected and brought to life later. And I love that about our human biology. It's waiting. It's just waiting. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is a passion of mine, which is, I often describe it as ending the subtle war against human nature, like how can we make peace with it? And one of the things I love about polyvagal theory is, and I've been working with this idea, what I call stress intelligence, for a while, that stress is an ancient, more primary system than emotional intelligence, that stress evolved before emotions, and emotions are, the outcropping of understanding our stress, right? So whether we're in safety or in danger, right? So then all of a sudden the emotions start coming up and the signals start coming up. So what's beautiful about the polyvagal theory, because I kind of was like, oh, there's that thing, polyvagal theory. I'm seeing it everywhere. Right? Like another thing, right? And then my buddy Jesse, he's a great chiropractic, functional medicine guy, and he started talking about, I'm like, maybe I should pay attention to this, you know. And then what I found was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I've been thinking about for a long time. Explained in relationship to the nervous system, and that means, like you said, I don't have to go anywhere to find it. It's right here if I can open myself. And yet, it's called a theory, right? So help us just to kind of give breath to the perspective on that we are talking about a theory, and it's how it's held and how you hold and understand it as, you know, science, evidence, reality, or experiential tool, right? Where are you at with that?
It's a great question, and it is a theory. Steve's a academic. He's a scientist and an academic, and they create theories. They, you know, and they put them out there and for people to, you know, challenge or support, or, you know, let's see what happens. Let's see how it, you know, emerges and unfolds. And, you know, there have been hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed articles now that support his basic findings. I will say that there's also, you know, a group who are, you know, put out the conversation that there's a fallacy in Steve's theory, right? And I often meet people who come to my trainings who bring that up, right? And then colleagues have clients who say, but it's really not true. And I say, well, let's look at it this way. Steve just wrote an article, actually, and it's on the Polyvagal Institute website. It's called the Vagal Paradox, I believe, that addresses the points of contention one by one. And this faction and Steve are having an argument about something. You might like it. It's something that happened 400 million years ago, right? There's a discussion about the branching off in the phylogenetic history, right? Which, okay, I read the article. It's a deep scientific read. I still don't understand it. And I have to say, as a clinician, it really doesn't make a difference, right? Because what happens for me when I, you know, teach people about their nervous system and they get to know how their nervous system works, they begin to change the way they navigate life, and they begin to have more capacity for connection and safety and regulation, and they begin healing. As a clinician, that's what I want to see. So, you know, I'm going to leave the scientific argument up to the scientists and the academics and say, for me, this is a brilliant theory. I will also say it will always be a theory. It's never going to move from theory to clinical protocol, right? Because what I teach and what other people, and nowadays, if you Google polyvagal theory, you're going to get just overwhelmed with stuff. But, you know, what I teach and what Steve and I really believe is you learn the outline of the theory, you learn the organizing principles. And then within that framework, it's more of this. You go where the nervous system of your client invites you to go, where the nervous system says, here's where some work needs to happen. So unlike, you know, take IFS, you and I are both IFS trained, unlike IFS that has more of a standard protocol that you follow with steps, in a polyvagal informed approach, you're going to use the organizing principles and you know, follow that pathway. So, you know, people ask me all the time, can I get certified in polyvagal, you know, theory therapy? I said, no, there's no such thing, nor will there ever be. But the joy of it is when you understand the organizing principles, you are going to go work with the nervous system in the way that works for you.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks. I agree with that. I mean, you know, Chinese medical theory and the explanation of Chinese medical physiology, you know, doesn't hold up exactly to what we know about the body now, but it's still effective.
Yeah, right.
It still works, right? So it doesn't have to. And I'm just interviewed someone who's in the Vedic tradition and the Kirtan tradition recently, and it's the same kind of thing. Like there's a whole story of gods and goddesses and qualities and attributes that people relate with and do practices with, and it makes a difference. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I'm with the embodied experiential level, but also like to kind of like push against a little bit of the science
Yeah.
and reality, and kind of keep both, as you said,
Absolutely.
bottom up, this is working.
Yep.
My nervous system's in a better state, and
Yeah.
top down, like what's going on?
Yeah.
What's my perception here?
Yeah. I mean, because lots of what Steve talks about, he began studying premature babies. That's where this all began. Who at that time we thought the vagus was life affirming, and the sympathetic was the fight and flight. That's all we knew. We didn't know there was a dorsal aspect. And someone asked, well, in premature babies, how can the vagus be both life affirming and life threatening? Because the dorsal would bring bradycardias and would stop hearts and stop breathing. And that's what set him off on this journey, which I love. I think it's a lovely starting place. But heart rate variability has been one of the things he's used, as a measure and studied for decades and decades. We can see the science of changes in heart rate variability as the nervous system reshapes in more regulated ways. So it's not that there's no science. It's just that, there's questions about, other things. And so I do like the both and. For me, that works. Yeah.
Agree. Does that bring us close to the vagal break? And is that something that's really important to understand when you talk about this theory?
Yeah, and the vagal break is I tell Steve all the time when I teach, it is so important and complicated, and sometimes people think it's backwards, it's paradoxical, it's confusing. So let's dive in for a moment. The vagal brake is one of the circuits of the ventral vagal system. It goes from your medulla to your heart. It goes to the sinoatrial node of your heart. And its job is to let your heart rate speed up or decrease. That's what it does. So it sort of creates that heart rate variability, right? And so your vagal brake always works, right? You don't have a broken vagal brake, right? We know that because every time you inhale, your vagal brake releases a little and your heart rate speeds up. Every time you exhale, it re-engages, your heart rate slows down. So everybody's vagal brake is working. It's how efficiently it's working that we're looking at now. So we're trying to find ways to measure vagal efficiency, right? Because if my vagal brake can only release a little bit before it lets go, and when the vagal brake reaches its limit, it lets go and you go into sympathetic survival, right? So instead of being able to use the energy of the sympathetic nervous system in a regulated way, which happens when the vagal brake releases but is still on. When the vagal brake releases all the way, you're now in survival. And so for many people, the vagal brake has a limited capacity, right? It can release just a little bit, and after that, it's gone and you're in survival. If you grew up in a dangerous world, that's usually your vagal brake's experience, right? And what we do in therapy is we exercise the vagal brake so it becomes more flexible. It has more capacity to release but not let go, right?
Yeah.
So it's a beauty, and it's part of your biology. I mean, people ask me all the time. They say, "No, it's truly part of your biology. This is something. It's a circuit that exists, and we can work with it to help it work more efficiently."
Which is amazing because in Chinese medicine, there's the pericardium channel, which is the heart protector. And the kidney channel runs right up, which is basically the place of fear and survival in the system, and runs right up through the heart and communicates with the pericardium.
Yeah.
Which is amazing just to see that overlay.
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit about this sense of, okay, so regulation is ventral regulation. Mm-hmm. Our neuroception says, hey, it's okay to be safe. Mm-hmm. And then there's this dysregulated idea, and at times I'm a defender of the ego because I believe the ego is part of the evolutionary project and it's part of the structures. I just think we're in a mismatch environment, and so the ego looks and smells worse than it actually is because our environments are radically different than what they were. And I'm also interested in the positive side of the sympathetic nervous system. Yep. And the dorsal vagus nerve. So can we kind of give some airtime to that? Yeah.
Yeah. So when ventral is around and it's working in connection with sympathetic, you can have this, and that this is really your vagal brake, right? Vagal brake has has allowed you to have a lot of access to sympathetic, mobilizing, activating energy under the management of ventral. That's what you might call that a positive sympathetic. That's a sympathetic that pushes you forward, and it's exciting, and you're active, and you're purposeful, and you're driven in a healthy way rather than out of a place of fear, right? So neuroception's one of safety, and you've got lots of energy flowing through your system because ventral and sympathetic are working together, right? The same is true of ventral and dorsal. When ventral dorsal work together, we can come to that lovely place of rest and renew, of becoming, I call it becoming safely still, because dorsal immobilizes you, but ventral brings the safety and the social connection. So I can sit in silence. We could sit together in silence, in companionable silence, and not feel worried that somebody has to say something, right? It's this beautiful place of renewal without ventral there. Dorsal rescues you from the overwhelm of sympathetic, so it gets you out of the flood of sympathetic fight and flight, but it doesn't fill you, it doesn't nourish you, it just gets you away from that. So it can feel like a relief, but it doesn't nourish you, it doesn't fill you the way it would if ventral was there too. So again, we see that ventral is this essential piece that has to be present in order for us to feel like we're being filled by anything.
How much of that is a mindset thing? I know for me, in the middle part of my marriage, Alice and I have been together. She's also a licensed clinical social worker, by the way, so nods to all the social workers in private practice doing therapy. But we've been together, 27 years, and I think there were some periods of time where I felt bad when I would shut down, and then I realized the less I felt bad about it, the more I was able to cycle through it. In other words, I started going, this may be like a stereotypical man cave thing, but I'd be like, okay, I need cave time. My nervous system is not working right now. So how much can we kind of just take the dorsal response, shift our mindset, give ourselves permission, and then all of a sudden we can get ventral to ourselves with ourselves?
So that's it. To be able to say, to recognize my nervous system needs me to leave and be by myself. That's the notice and name practice, right? And when you notice a name, you're already beginning to turn toward your dorsal rather than them being pulled into, right? And as we intentionally turn towards, say, okay, I'm just going to go lie down for a while. I'm just going to go be by myself for a bit. You're honoring the wisdom of your nervous system. You're allowing it to do what it needs to do. And again, it will help you begin to find your way back. Yeah. And just by not, being in that shaming, blaming of yourself and your system place, which reinforces the survival need, you are already beginning to soften that. Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful. Let me check my notes. Oh, I know. So I find once I started understanding Polyvagal Theory and in my IFS coaching with my clients that they actually validate each other.
Yeah. Yeah, they're easy.
They validate each other in this profound way that I started noticing, like, okay, that person's talking about their dorsal vagal response and it's being personified in this way, in this part, a blocking part, a collapse part. And then it was like, ooh, there's a sympathetic part. And then, oh, okay, here's self energy coming and helping. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have that same experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an easy integration. I think that's probably true for other models of therapy as well, because really we're all doing the same thing. We're just sort of going at it in a bit different way, but we're all working with the same thing. And what I say about, people ask me about IFS all the time, and what I say is, yes, self is one of the emergent properties of ventral, absolutely. Your firefighters are either going to be sympathetically charged or dorsal. They're going to either, be active, or they're going to make you fuzzy, numb, whatever. Your managers, some are sympathetic. You have managers who are ventral. And exiles are pretty much in a dorsal, shame-based exiled place, right? And I think the way I think about it is that when you enter a state, so if I enter into sympathetic dysregulation, then all of my parts that live in sympathetic dysregulation are now available to take over my system. And one of them is going to, right? The same is true for dorsal. I've got lots of parts that live in dorsal. When I enter dorsal, one of them is going to grab hold and say, I'm the one today.
Let's do it this way.
Yeah,
Let's do it
right,
this way. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my experience working with people who are both, parts savvy and wanting to work with their nervous system is I work with the state first, because if I work to help you find your way to sympathetic and bring some regulation to sympathetic, every part that lives there is having the benefit of that, right? Not just working with one part, I'm working with the state rather than the part, right? And I've discovered that there's this amazing sort of collective unburdening that can happen without you ever going to a part, because you're changing the environment that they exist in, and they unburden and restore automatically on their own. And then you find there are some parts that need, individual specialized attention. So for me, and when I do this, I'm always curious to see what people are going to say, because I have a lot of IFS therapists who do demos with me. And the last one, the woman said, oh my God, that just felt so efficient. And that's the word that I use all the time. It's efficient because you get a whole bunch of change happening at once. So, yeah.
So give an example of how you help someone regulate into a sympathetic state that helps a whole bunch of parts that are in the sympathetic domain.
So we anchor in ventral first, the two of us, right? And then from that anchor in ventral, we are going to then move to just outside the sympathetic experience, and we're going to stop there and feel what it's like to bring ventral to a place that is not familiar with that experience. And then we very slowly are going to, see what if we stepped inside and we came out and, the whatever happens inside there, it's a landscape in there that I usually help them bring to life, and we step into it and feel what happens as you bring some ventral tempering energy into the sympathetic environment.
Nice.
Right.
Yeah. So you focus a little bit more on the context of the landscape rather than what's the part there that's holding that voice.
Yeah, I don't care about the
and
part.
So by,
Yeah, I do. I take in the whole landscape and have the person, because they are in enough ventral that they can walk into that, what was a terrifying landscape. And I'm usually walking with them. That's the other thing. I always ask my clients, do you want me to go with you? Right? Yeah. Usually they say yes, because their experiences, they've been there alone, right? Trauma happens in isolation. Sometimes clients will say, no, but would you be where I can reach you if I need you? Absolutely, right? So we walk in, and then their biology has a different experience of what was sympathetic survival is now tempered by having ventral there too. So it changes the biology, and something reorganizes. And then oftentimes we do this work without ever knowing any of the story.
Amazing.
Right? Because we don't need the story. Yeah.
That's amazing, because, it's hit me at a lot of levels. But one I would say that really is speaking to me right now is the environmental aspect of it. So much of what we individually suffer with and we take as personal parts, that I have personal parts around this, are actually, and you talk about this in your book, anchored, the context, understanding the context. So I really love that your medicine and your healing path is thinking about the nervous system context. And I think for me, that's been a really freeing thing, because I know a lot of people walk around being like, why am I this way? And it seems like a personal failing, and the mistrust of the nervous system kicks in, yada, yada, yada. And you're like, no, the context in which you've been stewing is not clear. It's not right. So that's really, really profound. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I love that. Speaking of environments, are you okay looking at the kind of collective nervous system, right? Because we have how many nervous systems in America now?
Yeah.
And a lot of them are in all sorts of states and all over the world. There's war, there's famine, there's a lot going on, and it's heavy even to say it out loud right now. But how can something like this? I've been clear that internal family systems is helpful and a path for healing the suffering, among other paths. But how can polyvagal understanding the nervous system reach beyond the therapy room, reach beyond a podcast? Like, what's your sense of that? And I'm not, maybe you don't have answers. It's not, maybe it's an unfair question,
No,
but
I think I've been asked this a lot over the past months, and I teach, as you do, around the world, and around the world, people are suffering with dysregulation. And what I've come to, a couple things I've come to. One, we have great groups of people who are sympathetically dysregulated. They're in fight or they're in flight, right? And we have another great group of people who are in that hopeless despair collapse, right? And we have some people who are holding on to ventral, right? The trouble is we need more anchored in ventral so that we can then spread that energy out to invite the dysregulated nervous systems to feel a little bit safer, a little more welcome, so that they can begin to come to a bit more regulation, and we can begin to have some conversations, because we can't have conversations when we're in survival states. It's biologically impossible. So the goal is not to try and sit down and talk to someone who's sympathetically dysregulated. The goal is, what do they need to feel a little bit safer so they can come to a bit of regulation, so we then can talk, right? And systemically, yes, we have collective nervous systems. We have, dyads, we have families, we have culture, we have society, we have all these huge nervous systems, and we have systems that we need to try and shape differently. Academic systems, medical systems, political systems. I get overwhelmed pretty quickly when I think about these huge systems. I will say it is not my strong suit to try and figure out how to change those systems. And I can come back to this system, right? This system I have some management over. And I can come back and I can say, if I regulate my system, I know that I am putting that regulated energy out into the world, and every nervous system that is in the vicinity of my system feels that. And I think that creates this ripple effect. So for me, if I can regulate here, and I say this, I said it, sort of jokingly a few years ago, but now I say it, really honestly, we change the world one nervous system at a time, right? I can change this nervous system, and then I can offer you a different experience, and your nervous system changes, and then it ripples out in that way. And that, at the moment, is the only way I can think to keep hope alive for myself in this crazy world that we're living in, right? To know the power of ventral to offer safety to others, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I love the way you're describing that, and I have loved your advocacy today for a more loving relationship with our nervous system, and I can't think of a more direct conversation around my passion around stress and how humans work and our human nature than looking at the backbone of our nervous system. And you've done such a kind and beautiful job today helping me feel closer to how I work, and I know that there's a long road ahead of us for making the world more ventral, as you say, or more regulated. So I appreciate you so much for coming on the show today. Let me ask you, tell me a little bit about, how people can find you or how they can connect with polyvagal theory and what's on your horizon, because I know people are going to love this conversation and be like, how can I, where can I?
Well, I'm, it's interesting because I'm sort of thinking about what I want to do next. Right. It's an interesting time of life for me. I'm 71 and trying to figure out, what do I want to do with the years I have left. I just published the nervous system workbook, which I really like, and I'm talking with Sounds True about creating some sort of a program to help people go through it with me, so that we can do it together, because this is about doing things together. So that's exciting to me. I have the Glimmers journal, because Glimmers are a favorite of mine, is coming out in March, and I want to do something with that.
Fantastic.
So, get some projects going. If you come to rhythmofregulation.com, That's my website. And we try to, have lots of resources, free things, listings of what's coming up. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, to be in a place in life when you think, I have an opportunity to do something and I don't know what it is I want to do. I feel very lucky. I'm in a place in my life where I can say no to things. I can say yes to things. I can really choose. And with that feels a lot of responsibility, right? Oh my goodness. What should I choose? What do I want to choose? So I'm sitting with that.
Yeah. Well, blessings on that. And it's exciting to know you got more publications coming forward.
Yeah.
And thank you for choosing this podcast today. It's been great to have you on the
It's
show.
been lovely. Thank you.